Hello, and welcome to the South Coast Artists Index, where artists, performers, and writers, as well as curators, directors, and supporters, anyone with ties to the creative community, drops by to introduce themselves to you. We'll talk about their beginnings, their vision, their passion, and so much more. The South Coast Artist Index podcast is brought to you in part by Heavenly Spirits, who invites you to celebrate the art of life and creative communities everywhere. Learn more at heavenlyspirits.com.
Hi, this is Ron Fortier with another episode of the In Focus podcast, brought to you by the South Coast Artist Index.com. And today we have a guest who I believe is going to mark somewhere around the 70s, not her age. But that somewhere, I think 70 podcasts that we're at, could be even over that. And that's quite a milestone for us. So without any further delay, I'll allow our guests to introduce themselves and spell their names for us as well.
Hello, I am Carol Way Wood. And that's spelled CarolWaywood, 3 names. And actually, I'm 72. So wouldn't it be great if this was the 72nd broadcast?
We might be able to fix that. I don't know. Yeah, it's kind of funny. I always do the thing with the name. Do you ever have any difficulties with your name, or do people try to put Waywood together as one word? Or
yes, they do all the time.
All right.
Not all the time, but some of the time.
Yeah.
But my mother was an artist, and she used her maiden name, which was Godwin. So her name was Grace Godwin Way. So it just seemed natural for me to use Carol Waywood. And I should also say that by way of introduction, that I live in South Dartmouth, Massachusetts, and I grew up in Sudbury, Massachusetts, and I attended the museum school in Boston for 2 years, and then came down to Dartmouth to be a summer babysitter and transferred to the Swain School of Design and received my BFA from there in 1972. And I've pretty much been here ever since, except for 7 years when I lived in Colorado.
It's interesting how the path of our lives goes. I was at the museum school for it was for a summer acceptance program, and unfortunately, the tuition. This was 1971. The tuition was way too much, so I trotted down to SMU with portfolio in hand and managed to get myself in there for way less money. I still think it's a lie when I tell younger people I went to SMU for 4 years for the grand total of $2,400.
It's amazing how much less money it was. And
yeah.
And there are some great teachers, and were some great teachers at SMU.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm sure you got a good education.
Yeah, although I'll tell you, just that summer program alone, I learned a lot at the Boston, the School of Museum of Fine Arts. I also missed the Yellow Submarine for the sandwich shops. Those, yeah, that was always the highlight of my day to go to the Yellow Submarine and get a crab sandwich, a crab sub. With the chips and the drink, but crazy things that you remember.
Yeah.
So now the Swain School, there are so many Swainies out and about, and it is amazing to me. Being from SMU. I mean, although our class, the class of 75, it's weird because I just had another podcast where. I can't remember the guest, but they said like around just prior to 71, the SMU or SMTI people didn't want anything to do with the Swain students, and yet our class was always over there, and you guys were always over, in our digs, in our part of the woods, which I guess is a good thing because in actuality um, we are all related because the founder of our art department was a former Swain instructor. And I think, again, I've got to really look into it. He was either an interim president or
Who was that?
Ed Togneri.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. And so, you know, we're all from the same we're all from the same branch, so to speak, because Don Wilkinson posted something on Facebook a couple of days ago talking about David Loeffler Smith's concept of the artist family. I think it's the artist family, where he was instructed by Hans Hofmann, who was instructed by, and Togneri was also a student of Hoffman as well. So it's an interesting thing. What are some of your fondest recollections of the Swain School?
Let's see. Well, I had gone to junior college before I went to the museum school, so I didn't have to take any academic courses. So I remember starting as kind of a part-time student. I think I went in the afternoons, and I'm trying to remember the name of the building we were in a lot of the time. It was a low building. And then I was over with the graphic designers, because my major was graphic design. And I'm still in touch with a lot of those people through Facebook. It was just a great time. And I think, see, I have one friend from the museum school who I'm still in touch with, but I would say I have many more, just even from my year or the year before, the year after. I have probably 10 or 15 friends. And then there's so what do I remember about it? I remember about it being small and personal, and you got a lot of attention, and I guess I would reiterate that there was a great camaraderie, because it was a small group of us. But then I came back as a trustee, and then I did alumni relations and fundraising. So I really did everything at Swain except teach. And I think because I came back doing alumni relations and I had an office in the Crapo building, you know, I remember Don Wilkinson with great affection for his swagger, his attitude, his shenanigans. You know, he was just a real force. And I guess one of the things that I should mention that I really remember with great affection were the Swain auctions. Did you ever participate in those? Or you?
Probably, but everything's kind of a fog. And it's weird. Sometimes an episode of my life will just pop in my head for what I understand to be no particular reason, and I'll go, "Wow, I totally forgot about that," and boom, here it is. So it is possible because let's see. I'm trying to remember one of the last episodes I remember, John Robson, which is a whole nother story.
Right.
His dad and my dad were roommates, and there's a whole backstory to that. And so I always tell people I knew John since before he was born, which I actually did, because his mom Inga was my first crush, believe it or not. When I saw David introduce Inga to my dad and my stepmom, it was like, oh my God, she's the most beautiful woman I've ever seen in my life. And then seeing John grow up, and he was very, very different. He was much too sophisticated for a kid from around here. That's my take on him. And I remember being there in the Rodman building,
right,
in the back where the Rasta band was going. So I remember the Rasta band, and that kind of looseness and craziness weren't really afforded to us at SMU because, well, we weren't even a college. We were a department. we were stuck up in the what they refer to now as the liberal arts building, which was Group 1, the first building. And it wasn't ever built for us. But we got by. And I think what we loved about the Swaneys back then was that they had this freedom. And it's funny because it all depends on who you speak with. We thought we were better painters and they were far superior designers. And a couple of the Swaneys I've spoken to, their opinion was totally the opposite.
Right. They thought they were the better painters and you were the better designers. Well,
Yeah.
I just have to say one more thing about the
Yeah.
auction.
Yeah.
So when we would do the auctions, kids would donate their work, and we'd mat it, and sometimes we'd frame it. I remember cutting tons of mats, and Tom Corey would design a poster, which was a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really interesting to think back on this, because it would be a big event. People from the community would come. They'd spend all kinds of money buying this art. I'm sure some of it ended up being hung up and some of it probably didn't. But it was a really wonderful fundraising event. We made good money, but everybody had a great time. I mean, there was a real sense of, it was like putting on a play or something where, everybody worked behind the scenes for weeks ahead of time, and then you had the big event. So I do remember that very fondly, and I think still have some things that I bought at the auction. I know I do.
Mm.
Yeah, Swain was a good experience for me. I mean, I always knew I wanted to be an illustrator, and they didn't have a department of illustration, so design was the next best thing. And having a solid design background is very helpful when you're doing illustration work. So all of that worked out for me.
Mm. Now you are primarily a children's.
Well, I'm not primarily anything. I am a children's book illustrator, but I also do a lot of work for, I create greeting cards, and I always like to say I do things for the gift market. I do a lot of prints. It's an interesting thing that there seems to be a shift in the collecting public where, and I think it's moving back a little bit, but for a while there, they didn't want to buy originals. They wanted to buy prints. So I take a lot of my originals and turn them into prints. And I've done 6 books, and I'm about to start a 7th book. I've done a lot of editorial and educational illustration. So that was always my goal, was to be an illustrator, but I've done a bunch of different things along the way. Now I've been doing, the last couple of years, I've done a calendar. So that meant 12 new pieces of artwork each time. And that's been a lot of fun and very successful. And yes, I do think of myself as an illustrator, and I try and help a lot of other illustrators get their work published. But there again, the publishing arena has really changed. So I now self-publish as opposed to working with a publisher.
Yes, a lot of things have changed significantly, which it's just a march of time, I guess. I think it's also interesting to note that you are the second of 2 women that I know who are illustrators, primarily children oriented. Mary Montero. I haven't seen her in quite a long time. And I remember also a time where when I was doing illustration just for survival, before I really got into my advertising agency, my business, which was just a fallback, there was a time there where it was very difficult for illustrators because of digital was starting to come into force, and illustrators were seen to be like, poo-pooed. Their pricing for their illustrations seemed to have dropped significantly. It wasn't even worth doing illustrations. Did you run into anything like that?
Oh, yes. And I have an illustrators group that I belong to, and we all ran into it. They wanted everything overnight because the prevailing wisdom was that you could do it so much faster on the computer, and they wanted it for half the money, you know. And so it was a really tough time for illustrators. Now I think that's moving back a little bit. My illustrator friends are getting book deals. I mean, they weren't even getting book deals for a while. Um, I mean, unfortunately, this corresponds to a lot of other industries where the bottom line became more important than the product, you know, than what they were producing. Um, it used to be in children's book illustration that an editor or art director would take on a young writer or a young illustrator and give them a couple of books, even if they knew they weren't going to be hugely successful, just to get them in the door and to get them working in the right direction. And these art directors would really work with the artist and bring them along, or the writer and bring them along. And that just sort of disappeared, because it became so important for these publishing companies to make money. And then that's when you had celebrities writing books or having, or, you know, ghost written books, because a celebrity name would sell a book, as over content. But I think that's moving back again. I mean, now there are a lot of very small publishing companies too that are doing some great books.
Yeah. I'm thinking back in time where at one time an illustrator, because of retail, because of the way things were, you cut your teeth, so to speak, doing the pen, the speedball, the pen and ink
Right.
illustrations. Milt Healy, who unfortunately I believe passed away while I was away in Portugal. I hadn't seen him before I left for Portugal. I had always would see him on Saturday at Shaw's, and he was one of those people who he would tell me stories like they would just drop a cardboard box full of shoes on the floor next to his drafting table, and what he was supposed to do was take each one of those shoes out and do a pen and ink illustration of it. They would do cuts for newspaper ads for all of the retailers, and that's what kept them going. It was bread and butter work. I mean, there was no joy in it, but it was muscle memory. It was all those academic things that you thought you were done with. And then my studio mate at the University of Miami, Leon Rosenblatt, spent some time in New York City. He ended up winning several international illustration awards. He did all of those romance covers for the pocketbook series.
Um,
Woman exposing cleavage draped over bulky, muscly guy on left arm, on the right arm. It was a formula, and he could knock these things out. He could knock these things out in 3 hours time, and that's how he lived. Um, One of his illustrations that nearly anybody who ever liked to listen to Styx, the group Styx, the one with Merlin holding the orb is his, and he, I believe, won an award for that. So he went back to school because he needed to get an MFA to teach illustration. And then, of course, back then in the 70s, the big guy that everybody wanted to be was Bernie Fuchs, who was he was a painter, he was an illustrator, he walked that really fine line, almost like Rockwell did. Although Rockwell, I was fault, and I don't know what your opinion is, but an illustration is a complete story, whereas a painting is an unfinished story. And the illustration has to be finished because it's accompanied by words, whereas a painting stands alone by itself. So I don't know what your thoughts are on that as
I,
an
I,
illustrator.
I think a good illustration is also a good painting. And I'm not sure that all illustrations tell a complete story. I think some of them because you've got the words in most cases, although the next book I'm working on doesn't have any words. So it's just supposed to flesh out the story and tell some of it, so that you don't have to use words for every single thing the way you do in a novel that doesn't have illustration. But going back to Bernie Fuchs for a minute, I think it was called the Illustrators Workshop twice, and he was involved in that. And there were a bunch of New York illustrators and a couple from the Midwest that participated in that, and they'd have a week-long conference, and it was in Tarrytown, New York for many years at Marymount College. But it would be Bernie Fuchs, Alan Kober, Mark English, John DeCesar. I'm blanking on the other names, but there were 9 or 10 of them that would do it. And they'd come and lecture, and they'd also have other people come, like Brad. I remember hearing Brad Holland speak. And that was really interesting. And I learned a lot from that. And Bernie Fuchs was one of the featured people.
Yeah, I was kind of influenced by him because another one of my studio mates, Peter Zorn, who was another. All of the people that were that I hung around with in my class were all former somebodies. They already had careers, and then they decided they wanted to teach, and so they went for their MFAs. But Peter was very much influenced by by Bernie Fuchs and Mark English. And when I started, I got in because I had an abstract portfolio. But because of Peter, I started reinvestigating the narrative again. And I think it had a lot that influence was hard to beat. And I think Peter knew them personally. So, that was another thing. It's funny because we were talking about how the illustrators, the pay scale and so on and so forth. I did some quick math while I remember when I first started writing that it was 50 cents a word for a 750 word article. I mean, so that was like $300 something. Today it's a penny a word. We've gone backwards. It's kind of bizarre.
It is bizarre.
Huh?
It is bizarre. I mean,
Yeah.
I was going through old files because I used to create a file for each job I did.
Yeah.
And I used to be paid much more than I'm paid now,
I'm sorry, so a dime a word. Yeah, it went down. It's really kind of crazy. Now, as an illustrator, what demand is there out there? In case there are parents listening to this, or to use the old-fashioned term, budding artists, what demand is there out there now for illustrators?
Well, there are books. There are children's books. There are picture books and young adult books that have some illustration. And then there are also odd little niches for illustration that have to do with the computers. And I'm trying to think. I met a woman recently whose son had gone to art school, and of course she thought he was never going to make a living, and then lo and behold he got a job for some company and is doing all their illustration. So there's still this is not children's book illustration, but it is illustration. He's probably doing packaging and may even be doing some animated ads for them. So there's definitely still jobs. I mean, because I started creating stuff for the gift market, I created my own little business, and I've done 2 of my own books, which I now get, print on demand, so I can continue selling them. That actually works very well because, you can order from 1 to 999 copies at a time. And I usually order a dozen or a few dozen. And then I sell them at certain shops, and I sell them when I do shows. I think I'm getting off track here a little bit. What was your question again?
Wait,
I hope you're editing.
no, the question was, at the illustrators today, what is
Oh,
the
what are we
demand?
doing?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
My illustrator friends, when there are I have one friend who does a lot of licensing work. So she's doing wrapping papers and journals and, Christmas items. And she's very successful. She goes to the Surtex show, which Surtex stands for surface texture. And, all the artists that go there are licensing their work to companies. And, every time you buy napkins that have a picture on them, cocktail napkins
Right.
or paper plates or paper cups that have any kind of pattern on them, that was all done by some artist. And then I have friends who are actually doing books for different publishers. I think that there is a resurgence in people reading to their children. They really realize how important it is to read to them at night. So I would say it's, I don't know that it's ever going to be like the golden age of illustration. The golden age of illustration was actually in maybe the 20s and 30s. That's the NC Wyeth.
Right, Montgomery, I think was the other guy.
Yeah, James Montgomery. That was when my grandfather was illustrating, and he was friends with James Montgomery Flagg. But then there was another time, probably in the 50s and 60s and early 70s, when it was very hot. And there were a lot of magazines that were, like the Ladies' Home Journal and, True Magazine, all had illustrations to go with their stories. But now I think a lot of people are being very independent and creative about what they do. And of course, there are video games, those require illustration. Which is kind of an animation. What else are my illustrator friends doing? I mean, I have one friend who's very talented. She's been doing, she's on Facebook a lot. She's done books, but then she's been making masks. And she's done a lot of little prints with, creating prints with rubber stamps and she's doing mice and other little animals. And she makes these rubber stamps and then she creates backgrounds for them and creates pictures that she then makes into prints. And of course, I suppose we should bring up social media marketing, because there are a lot of people that are selling a lot of stuff online, painters and illustrators.
I mean, you mentioned about the flip-flop, where at one time prints were acceptable, but now the original illustration is more acceptable. I just interviewed Michael Rose last night, who was an art appraiser, art historian. He's also an artist. And it's kind of, like he said, it all depends on who you speak with. Because there's one school of thought that believes, for example, like I'm looking on getting into it, and it's been a long time coming, because it takes me a while to get. If somebody else, I could give you all the advice in the world and push you into doing it. With me, it's I have to drag myself screaming and kicking to do something. But the especially since I've gone back to narrative work. So in some situations, by producing giclée on fine art paper, hand signed, that kind of thing, whether it's open edition, closed edition, it sometimes diminishes the price of the original, but in other times it actually increases the price of the original, because the demand for the print signifies a pent-up demand for the original, but that market that buys the prints can't afford the original.
Right.
If that makes any sense at all. But the art world has always been crazy.
Yes, it has always been crazy, particularly around what the value of things are, and what's fine art and what's even art, period. You either have to sort of accept that it's all art, whether you think it's good or bad.
Mm-hmm.
There's a place for it. But yeah, I mean, there are some artists that are hot in New York City that I don't get why they're hot.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
there's that sort of thing. But the whole print thing is so interesting because, of course, now we can create really beautiful prints on fine art paper, as you said, with archival links. And yeah, I have people that come to my shows and there's the original hanging there. And they say, "Can you make me a print?" And sometimes I say yes, and I charge them a fee to make it into a print in addition to the cost of the print, because you have to have it scanned. And I mean, I
Yes.
can scan things at home, but I often have them professionally scanned at Riverside Art, who I would put a plug in for because I think they do an excellent job. Um, yeah, go figure. I mean, I do think that now that people, because of the pandemic, people are working at home. They have home offices. They want to have something nice on the wall. And I think they are buying more artwork. I mean, strangely enough, this is, because I am also in a co-op gallery in Paden Aram.
Mm-hmm.
We had the best Christmas season we've ever had. Go figure.
Is that 5.5?
6.5.
6.5.
Yeah,
I was close.
And other shops that I've talked to, other galleries that I've talked to have done really well. And yet there are other places that are really struggling. So I don't know, this thought just came to me, but I'll throw it out there. I think in the Boston area, where there have been so many high paid people, the economy, what's been explained to me is that the economy is contracting more rapidly up there. And so they're not having the great sales that we're having down here on the South Coast. And by the same token, there are a lot of well-to-do people that are moving to this area now, because if you're going to work at home, why not live in a beautiful place? And they're bringing their money in.
Yeah, one of my wife's clients he's a design builder, but he's also they're artisanal homes. Let's call it that.
Right.
And his starting price for the homes are 3 million and up, and there's a boom in that multi-million-dollar market right now, and the regular homes nothing's happening. So those builders are like kind of squeezed out of the market unless they go into there. So there's and also discussing with Michael and several others like Don Wilkinson, there are artists who before the pandemic were not represented. They either couldn't get represented, they didn't think they were good enough to be represented, or whatever the case. And then there were the artists who were represented and doing very, very well. Well, the weird thing is that during this past year of pandemic, the artists who are not represented all of a sudden are getting unsolicited commissions and unsolicited sales that are coming out of left field just because of their presence on Facebook or because they may have a website. And the ones who were doing very, very well prior to the pandemic are, to use the old term, crying in their beer. They're not moving anything. Yeah. So there are so many variables out there that it's really kind of crazy. In investigating the first images that I'm going to be putting out there and speaking with the production house, they suggested, okay, put one piece out, a print, and then put one as a gallery wrap canvas. And I said, people are going to buy, or they're going to buy a fake painting. And I said, oh yeah, you'd be surprised how crazy it is that people, they want the painting because they love the image. Okay. They may like you or love you, but they can't afford your, say, $5, $8, $10,000 price, but they're damn happy to plunk down $500
For
for
a print.
that, for a printed canvas. Yeah.
Yeah.
And my jaw dropped. And the other thing that's really bizarre, the price point. I mean, when you factor in the initial scan and then producing the first one, because you always lose money on that first one, sometimes two or three. The prints, the giclées are more expensive to produce because of the price of paper than the gallery canvas, which is like unbelievable, unbelievable. So you learn. Even at our age, you're learning because nothing's static; it's constantly shifting. Um, Live galleries have been eviscerated, and again, depending on where they are, as you said. And there are hybrid galleries, the artist's studio gallery and such that are making a living. I did an article for Artscope last year, I believe, on galleries and the New Bedford economy. We really don't even have a number of census, an actual census of how many artists there are in the city proper, and then what used to be referred to as Greater New Bedford or the South Coast. But when you think of the vitality of this area, that's, I guess, really surged in the last 5 years. The last commercial gallery was Luis Villanueva in Colo Colo. And,
Is he closed now?
He's semi-closed. Luis has been plotting and planning something for a long, long time that he's going to launch. He was going to do that outdoor gallery. The new owners of the Kilburn Mill came in. They're very, very supportive. But then, of course, we had the pandemic. And then they found a groove that I don't think they expected. I mean, they are on such a roll. I thought it would take them quite a while to catch up to Hatch Street, only because Hatch Street had years on them,
Right.
and 60 plus artists there. But they're doing a phenomenal job down there. But the idea of a commercial gallery now with all this competition online, and it seems the millennials are the core market, they grew up with visuals on screen.
Right.
They grew up with Amazon. They grew up with video games, the whole 9 yards. So for them to buy a piece of artwork off of a screen instead of going into a physical space is not an issue.
Right.
And so there's a plethora of those. I mean, Saatchi's probably one of the oldest. Then there's U Gallery. Then there's Luminaire that I was associated with in England. My God, there's so many more. I can't even think of them all. So there are much more outlets out there. But I think at some point, the market is going to have to shift where somebody's going to have to grab the reins. It's going to have to be a local concern that's going to take a hold of local art sales, even though it's done virtually. And it may be a 50-50 thing where they have a brick and mortar location, but a majority of their sales are through the internet. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens with that. Getting off topic. Do you think it would ever be possible well, I've always been advocating for a high school of visual and performing arts in this area, because that would be a crowning glory now. I think that would really solve a lot of, I hate to use the term social ills, but it would really solve a lot of problems. It would really put a lot of children, a lot of teens, young adults onto a different life path. But what do you think of the possibility of somebody coming back and opening up a school like Swain? Is the time right? Is it ever going to be right? Where you've got it limited to, say, 100 people. That's it. That's what their operating model is, 100 students.
It would be so cool if they could have a school of applied and visual arts in that old theater that's down at the end of Route 18.
Oh, the Orpheum. Yeah.
The Orpheum. Oh my God, wouldn't that be fabulous to be in
Yeah.
there? I certainly wouldn't rule it out. I think it's a great concept. And I'm a great believer in anything's possible. And particularly if it was not just visual arts, but if it was performing arts also, you know, you'd get all the people interested in hip hop and rap. And I don't know if you'd have anything to, you know, if there's a lot for, I'm thinking classical music might not be, there might not be a classical music part to it because there are such great places up in Boston, but certainly rock and folk and, you know, all that stuff. And then the visual art. I mean, I get people all the time asking me for lessons. I can see how that could really work. Have you talked to Catherine Carter?
The last podcast we did, and a couple of times we bumped into each other. We've kicked around that concept because I really think it is possible. I mean, for example, you're going to need a financier. Now, the gentleman of the family who owns Chumley's, and they pretty much, from what I have heard, have bought up half of Payneham. You need to have an individual like that has this love for the arts. I mean, don't forget, I'm sitting here in the town of Fairhaven that wouldn't have existed as it does without Henry Huddleston Rogers. We need the age of the benefactors to come back, because, well, you know, they made it to a certain point in life, and now now they have the ability to, I hate the word give back. It always makes me feel like somebody has stolen something or taken something they shouldn't, but they have now the opportunity to share. And of course, if you don't have any, if the arts don't give you any joy or whatever, why the heck would you finance an art school? You know, unless it was strictly a business thing. But that's what we need. We need to have people of that ilk to come in, or as I was thinking, I have a grand uncle who published 6 Portuguese language newspapers in the city. He was an odd duck. I'm really still trying. I mean, it's because of him that I became an artist, but that's another story. But I'm thinking about the Portuguese American Civic Associations of the Portuguese Congress, where here are all these immigrants who basically were living hand to mouth, working in the mills. And yet they created these institutions. They opened up their own bank, the Luso Bank. I mean, you know, there's like all these other things. So maybe it's Stone Soup. Maybe that's what we need, is to have Stone Soup. And maybe if each one of us pitched in $10 or whatever to start an endowment, and bring back, you know, a remanifestation of the Swain. And you talk about classical. Well, my introduction to SMU was when I was still in high school, and my English teacher, his family was, you know, they were born in the trunk, so to speak, in the backstage of the Strand kind of thing. But introduced me to the Colberts, Madame Jacqueline Bazine Colbert and Joseph Colbert, who ran the opera department at SMU. And people were like, there was no opera department there. Like, yeah, there was. So, I mean, we had an opera department, an internationally acclaimed opera event, I guess you could call it, called the Kodali, that was led by Boris Goldovsky, that I grew up listening to on that crazy uncle's Philco radio. You know, the woo, you know, get the sound. Yeah. And so why not? Why not? I mean, I think we're at a point right now. I think that this pandemic, for all intents and purposes, is causing us to, you know, necessity is the mother of invention. But I think it's really causing us to reevaluate, or maybe even wish again. And maybe it's the pandemic and the change of the political structure, even though we're only, you know, a day into it. But Who knows? Who knows?
Well, I think the pandemic has had some very good um, parts to it in a sort of odd kind of way. And the more, I mean, I'll be thinking about this idea that you've raised because you get a lot of time to think while you're making art. Um, and it's a very intriguing idea because now that you have all these people that would like to live down on the South Coast because it's so beautiful here, and there are a lot of artists already. There are a lot of very accomplished, actually, artists and writers and musicians. I could really see this happening. And there are some people. I think there are some people. I mean, I think you'd have to do. Well, Roger Mandel, he started to do his thing, and then
Mhm.
of course, unfortunately, he passed away. And I don't know how well they did with their fundraising. I don't know if they have an endowment for DACA or not, but I think you'd have to put some feelers out and maybe find a couple of benefactors. And I mean, you'd have to have that, I've done professional fundraising. You have to have all those tiers. Like you have
Mhm.
a lot of people giving at the $10 range, and then you have a few giving at the $250 range and so on up. And then you have a few people that are giving you, would be nice if
Thousands.
they each
Yeah.
gave you $1 million. And I mean, I don't think that probably the Orpheum is realistic just because it needs so much renovation, but where
Well,
would you put the school?
they have that adjacent empty lot which they could build an addition on,
Yeah.
and
And if you did it as a charter school, would that be the thing to do it as a charter school?
I think it would be. I mean, a char and it's, the whole history of the charter school, with Horace Mann. Is that one of the organizations, one of the charter
Charter
school
schools?
components?
I
Yeah.
think, I think it is. And then there's,
Um, uh, don't forget the the history of the charter schools is a little murky because it's a certain political party who decided that they wanted to do school vouchers, free choice and so on and so forth. And all that meant was that their kids didn't have to go to a integrated school,
mhm.
uh, which is kind of bizarre because if you had that kind of money, why would you just send your kid to a private school anyway? But that's a whole nother story. But yeah, that's definitely a possibility. One that just focuses on, and I'm sure there are national models. I'm sure there are models right here in the state, but that would be really great. And why separate things? Why not have it so that they're the Swain School, the resurrection of the Swain School begins as a junior college, which is 2 years. So you go for 4 years through this visual and performing arts high school, and then if you want to to prepare yourself, you go into the 2 years of this junior art school, uh,
Right.
and then you can be jettisoned into wherever, the School Museum of Fine Arts or RISD or whatever. But it's all a possibility. I mean, as I do this show, people say, "Oh, what's the agenda? What are we going to talk about? What do I have to prepare for?" And it's like, no, I never know where the conversation is going to go, and because the conversation is never finished, because you're always invited to come back to say, "Hey, the last time we were just like all over the place, but this time I want to focus on this." It's like, yeah, fine, that's good. Um, and by doing this show, one of the big plans is to get every one of these shows transcribed, and of course they've got to be edited, to because the transcription devices, they'll how odd it is. It's even like with the OCR, the optical character recognition, it would screw up words and such. But the point is now that we have all this data, we have all these words, and now we can edit them, literally, edit them into a story of sorts, on all the profilees or all the guests that we've had on the show, and then also have that an overarching editorial component where, almost like an art history thing, because every one of the 70 plus people that I've spoken with uh, are part of this history. History is now. It's not yesterday. It's now. And I want to publish an ebook and then probably a printed book, because there's still comfort in smelling and touching a book.
Oh, I
I
totally
don't,
agree with you.
right? And it just makes it much more important. If you're in an ebook, well, that's kind of cool. But if you're in a published book, and I want to call it the first 50, it would come out every 50 interviews. We would do this, and that overarching editorial aspect to it would be about the art history of this place. I spoke with Mary Jean Blasdale, who was the inspiration for starting this crazy journey that I've been on, because she clipped out she put an ad in the old Standard Times Bowsprit magazine, I think it was. She had about 125 artist names, and she said, a birthday, anything, please just let me know about these people. And she went back, I think, probably as far as the 1750s, all the way up to 1949, I think she said. And the conversation I had with her a couple of months ago, she said, I would love to be able to pick up where you are now from 49 onwards. Because now, I mean, imagine that we would have this encyclopedic knowledge of artists in this area. And I said, that's what you inspired me to do. And I just thought that would be such a great thing, because we are important. As artists, we are looked at by certain elements of society as, well, it's a cultural thing. I tell people, when I was in Portugal, and they would ask me, what do you do? And I tell them, and they're like, oh my God, that's great. Have I seen one of your paintings? Are they on display? You're exhibiting right now. They're in books. Where can I access your work? Over here, it's like, what do you do? I'm a painter. Oh, you make a living doing that? you know? And it's important, because when I was teaching at the community level, it was really highly emotional for me. It was almost like I was an art psychiatrist, art therapist, and I've got to get Jane Richardson on this show, but to talk to her about that. But I had adults who were considered very good as young people, and then some adult came along and pretty much slapped them on the hand and said, no, you've got to do something that's going to make you a living.
Yeah, going back to, excuse me for interrupting you, but you were saying, people say to you, you say, I'm a painter, and they say, oh, can you make a living at that? And what went through my mind is, you can make a life. You make your life as a painter, or as an artist, and maybe you make a lot of money and maybe you don't, but what's inside of you is so rich. You just can't quantify it in a way. And it's a sad thing that in the United States, people don't revere artists more, because we create the magic.
Yeah. My wife is of the same thought. She always, when I get frustrated, she says, okay, you've got to make a choice. Do you want to be sustained by your art? And she's an illustrator. She's a graphic designer who's an illustrator. And she taught illustration on keyboard, as we used to say back in those days. And that's really her love. But she asked me, she says, you've got a choice. Do you want to be sustained by your art, or do you want to be supported by it? And I said, what's wrong with both? She said, well, it just may not be possible.
Yeah. I mean, there's nothing wrong with both, but she's right. It just may not be possible. For some people it is, and for some people it isn't.
Yeah. And it's about timing. It's not how good are you, because I have seen artists, and we've all seen artists, where we just, bite our tongue. You go, oh my God, how is this lucky fool? How are they so successful? And I'm so frustrated. It's because we lived through critique. That was part of our training. And and you're looking at someone's work, and it's like, you don't they're nice people. You don't respect the work, and yet they're making money hand over fist because they know how to play the system, or the timing was right for them, or they just have better business acumen,
Right.
So with that in mind, we're going to start to wrap it up. Any thoughts, any words of wisdom, I usually ask people, how would you like to be remembered?
How would I like to be remembered? I would like to be remembered as somebody who promoted kindness through my work. And this has been a fascinating conversation, and I know I need to get you in touch with Christine, and I will do that. If I had any advice for anybody, it would be just keep doing it, because it takes a long time to get to be good. It takes, I think somebody studied it, and it takes about 10 years to get to be good at anything that you do. And, you know, when I decided when I was 8 that I wanted to be an illustrator, I was not really that good all the way through high school. It wasn't until I got out of school, till I really got out of Swain even, that I kind of figured out what I hadn't learned yet that I wanted to know, and taught myself those things. And just in my case, I think drawing is super important. And I've just kept drawing and drawing and drawing and drawing. And now I'm getting pretty good at it. So,
Yeah. You reminded me of that old television commercial, for V8 juice, where the actor in the commercial would always smack themselves on the forehead.
Oh yeah.
You know, the open palm on the forehead, and go, I could have had a V8. All right.
Yeah.
And I always wonder about the last seconds of life, you know, as an artist, where you don't want to be laying there and go smack yourself on the forehead and go, damn, now I know this is not fair. You know what I mean? It's like when you're having a conversation with someone and you can't remember anything for the life of you. And for example, say you have to drive home after that meeting, and you know what's going to happen. Halfway between the meeting place and your home, that's when you remember. Oh, that's when you know. It's kind of crazy. I'm going to wrap this up, and then we'll have a couple of minutes right after we stop recording.
Okay.
Well, I want to thank our guest, Carol Way Wood, illustrator, and who maintains a residence and a studio in South Dartmouth, Massachusetts. And I want to thank you for listening to this episode, and reminding you that this is a journey for everybody. And no matter what we do it with a good heart, and make sure that we're all kind to each other out there. Thanks a lot. Ron Fortier, In Focus Podcast. Bye-bye.
We'll see you next week for another episode of the South Coast Artist Index podcast. The South Coast Artist Index podcast is brought to you in part by Heavenly Spirits, who invites you to celebrate the art of life and creative communities everywhere. Learn more at heavenlyspirits.com. To learn more about the South Coast Artist Index, visit theartistindex.com. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Be the artist you believe you are, and let's take care of each other out there.